In the summer of 1483, two young boys walked into the Tower of London. They were princes. One of them, a 12-year-old boy named Edward, was supposed to be crowned King of England within days. They were seen playing in the Tower Gardens that summer. Servants saw them at the windows, and then one by one the sightings stopped. By the end of the year, nobody could say for certain whether they were alive or dead. Nobody produced a body. Nobody held a funeral. Nobody was ever put on trial for their murder. Their own uncle, the man who had custody of them, the man who stood to gain the crown the moment they were gone, became king instead. His name was Richard III. And for over 500 years, historians, novelists, kings and amateur detectives have been asking the same question. What really happened to the princes in the Tower? Was it their uncle? Was it a nobleman trying to win the new king's favour? Was it someone else entirely? Someone whose motive has been hiding in plain sight for centuries? In 1674, workmen tore up a staircase in the Tower of London and found something that shocked all of England, a wooden box containing the bones of two children. Today, those bones sit in a marble urn in Westminster Abbey. And to this day, nobody is legally allowed to test them. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this 540-year-old cold case still refuses to close, and which suspect the evidence actually points to. If you're into real royal history, the kind with actual bodies, actual betrayals, and actual mysteries that professional historians still fight about, hit subscribe now, because this channel is about to become your favorite rabbit hole. Let's go back to 1483 to understand why two children ended up dead or missing in a royal fortress. You need to understand the chaos that put them there in the first place. England, in the second half of the 1400s, was recovering from decades of civil war. Historians call it the Wars of the Roses, a brutal on and off conflict between two branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, both descended from King Edward III. Whoever sat on the throne rarely sat there for long. Kings were deposed, murdered, and replaced with exhausting regularity. By 1471, a Yorkist king named Edward IV had finally crushed his Lancastrian rivals and secured the throne. He was tall, athletic, famously charming, and by most accounts a genuinely capable ruler once the fighting stopped. He gave England over a decade of relative peace. He also married for love rather than political advantage, which was almost unheard of for a king. His wife, Elizabeth Woodville, was a commoner, a widow, no less, and their marriage scandalized the English nobility. Elizabeth came from a large, ambitious family, and Edward showered her relative with titles, marriages, and positions of power. This created deep resentment among the older nobility, especially Edward's own brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and one of the most powerful men in England, William, Lord Hastings. Keep both of those names in mind, they matter enormously later. Edward and Elizabeth had 10 children together. 2 of them are the boys at the centre of this entire story. Edward, Prince of Wales, born in 1470, the heir to the throne. Richard, Duke of York, born in 1473, his younger brother. Then, in April 1483, everything changed in an instant. King Edward IV, only 40 years old, still relatively young by the standards of the day, fell suddenly ill. Some accounts blame a chill caught while fishing. Others suggest years of extravagant living finally caught up with him. Whatever the cause, within about 10 days he was dead. His son and heir, Edward, was only 12 years old. England now had a child king, and in 15th century England, a child king was one of the single most dangerous situations the crown could face, because whoever controlled the boy controlled the kingdom. At the moment of his father's death, young Edward V was not even in London. He was in Ludlow on the Welsh border, being raised and educated under the guardianship of his mother's family, the Woodvilles, specifically her brother, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. Meanwhile, Edward IV will name his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector of England essentially, regent for the boy king until he came of age. This set up an immediate power struggle. Two factions wanted control of the new king. The Woodvilles, the Queen's family, who had been raising him for years and wanted to get him crowned quickly, before Richard could assert his authority as protector. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the late king's brother, who had been named protector and had no intention of watching the Woodvilles seize power around him. Richard moved fast. As the boy king and his Woodville escort travelled toward London for the coronation, Richard intercepted them at Stony, Stratford. He arrested Anthony Woodville and several other Woodville-aligned nobles on the spot, accusing them of plotting against him. Those men were later executed without trial at Pontefract Castle. Richard then took physical custody of the young King Edward V and escorted him personally into London, arriving in early May 1483. On the surface, this looked entirely legitimate. The Lord Protector was simply doing his job, protecting the king from a scheming faction. And to be fair to Richard, the Woodvilles genuinely had been trying to sideline him. But here's where it gets darker. Back in London, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, Edward V's mother, realised what was happening and fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, taking her younger son Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters with her. Sanctuary was a legal and religious protection that in theory made a person untouchable. Even kings were not supposed to violate it. Edward V, meanwhile, was lodged in the royal apartments at the Tower of London, which crucially was not just a prison. In the medieval period, the Tower was also a royal residence, traditionally where English monarchs stayed before their coronation. So at this point, nothing looked unusual. A king-to-be staying at the Tower before his crowning was completely normal. Then Richard did something that changed the entire trajectory of English history. He sent counsellors to Westminster Abbey and after tense negotiations convinced or pressured Queen Elizabeth to release her younger son, 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York, so that he could keep his brother company ahead of the coronation. On June 16, 1483, the younger prince joined his brother at the Tower. Both boys were now in Richard's custody, together, in one place. Their coronation was scheduled for June 22nd. It never happened. On June 22nd, 1483, just days before Edward V was due to be crowned, a friar named Ralph Shah delivered a sermon at St. Paul's Cross in London with an explosive claim that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had never been legally valid in the first place. The argument, later formalised in a document called Titulus Regius, claimed that Edward IV had been secretly pre-contracted to marry another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler, before he married Elizabeth Woodville. Under the church law of the time, a valid pre-contract to marry was treated almost as binding as marriage itself, meaning if it were true, Edward's later marriage to Elizabeth would have been bigamous, and every child from that marriage, including Edward V and his brother, would be declared illegitimate. Illegitimate children could not inherit the throne. Convenient, extremely. The woman supposedly involved in the pre-contract, Eleanor Butler, was long dead by this point and could not confirm or deny anything. No contemporary document proves this pre-contract ever existed outside of what Richard's allies claimed. On June 25th, an assembly of lords and commoners petitioned Richard to take the throne himself, since his nephews were now legally barred from it. Richard accepted. On June 26, 1483, he was proclaimed King Richard III. He was crowned on July 6th. His nephews, the boy, who days earlier had been King Edward V, and his younger brother remained in the Tower of London. And this is the exact moment where the historical record starts to go cold. Here's what we actually know from contemporary sources. The Italian visitor and church official Dominic Mancini, who was in London during this period and later wrote an account of these events, recorded that the boys were seen less and less often that summer. He wrote that Edward V's own physician, an Italian doctor named John Argentine, reported the boy confessed his sins daily and believed he might soon die, like a victim prepared for sacrifice. By around midsummer 1483, sightings of the boys described by witnesses as having been seen playing and shooting arrows in the Tower Gardens earlier that year simply stop appearing in the record. They were, in Mancini's words, seen more rarely behind the windows, and then not seen at all. No official announcement of their deaths was ever made. No funeral was held. No bodies were displayed, which was unusual. Medieval rulers frequently displayed bodies of dead rivals, specifically to prove they were actually dead, and prevent future pretenders from claiming to be them. The complete silence in a period obsessed with legitimacy and succession was itself deeply suspicious to contemporaries. By the following year, 1484, rumours were already circulating across Europe that the princes were dead. The Croyland Chronicle, written by an anonymous but well-informed contemporary source close to the royal court, states that by Christmas 1484, there was widespread belief in England that the sons of Edward IV had died by some unknown manner of violent destruction. So within roughly 18 months of entering the Tower, the general public understanding across England was already that these boys had been murdered. The only real debate then and now was who did it. Let's go through them properly, because this is where the video gets fun. This is a genuine historical whodunit, and the evidence for each suspect is worth taking seriously. Richard is by far the most commonly accused. The case against him is straightforward. Motive: he had just seized the throne from his nephews and declared them illegitimate. As long as they lived, they represented a constant threat, a rallying point for anyone who wanted to restore the rightful king. Opportunity: he had complete physical custody of both boys inside a secure royal fortress that he controlled. Timing: the boys disappear from record almost immediately after his coronation. Behaviour afterward: Richard never produced the boys, never explained their fate, and never allowed anyone to verify they were alive, which, if they had simply died of illness, would have been an easy story to confirm, and would have ended damaging rumours instantly. Just weeks after Richard took the throne, a rebellion broke out in southern England in the autumn of 1483, known as Buckingham's Rebellion, partly organised around the belief that the princes were already dead, and aiming to instead put a different claimant, Henry Tudor, on the throne. The fact that rebels pivoted immediately to a completely different candidate, rather than trying to rescue or restore the princes, strongly suggests that even people close to the court believed the boys were no longer alive by autumn 1483, mere months after Richard took power. The strongest circumstantial argument against Richard is this: he had by far the clearest motive and the only real physical access. Buckingham was Richard's closest ally in the early weeks of his reign. He helped engineer Richard's rise to power. Then, within months, Buckingham turned against Richard entirely and led the rebellion mentioned above. Some historians have floated a theory that Buckingham himself may have had the princes killed, potentially, even without Richard's direct order, perhaps to clear a path toward the throne for himself. He had his own, admittedly, weaker royal bloodline. Or possibly even acting on Richard's orders, and then using the resulting scandal to turn against him. The problem with this theory is thin evidence it's largely speculative, built on his later rebellion and the fact that he had access to the Tower through his position as Constable of England. But no contemporary source directly names Buckingham as the killer. This is the theory that tends to surprise people the most, and it's worth taking seriously because of who ends up benefiting most in the long run. Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August 1485, ending Richard's 2-year reign and founding the Tudor dynasty. Henry's own claim to the throne was, frankly, quite weak. He was descended from an illegitimate branch of the Lancastrian royal line. To strengthen his position, Henry married Elizabeth of York, the elder sister of the missing princes, uniting the two warring houses. Here's the catch: if the princes were still alive when Henry took the throne in 1485, they would have had a dramatically stronger claim to the crown than Henry himself. Edward V, in particular, would have been the obvious rightful king in the eyes of many. If Henry discovered the boys were still alive after he took power, he would have had every reason to quietly eliminate them himself. Suspicious supporting details: Henry never publicly accused Richard III of murdering the princes in any official document, despite otherwise producing an extensive list of accusations against Richard to justify his own seizure of the throne. If Richard had obviously and provably murdered 2 innocent royal children, you'd expect Henry's propaganda machine to have shouted it from the rooftops. The silence is strange. Additionally, Henry had Richard's alleged accomplice in the murders, a man named Sir James Tyrrell, arrested years later, in 1502, on an unrelated charge of treason. Tyrrell reportedly confessed to arranging the murders of the princes on Richard's orders before his execution. But this confession was never published in full. No transcript survives, and it conveniently arrived nearly 20 years after the fact, at a time when Henry badly needed to put the question to rest. Many modern historians view it with real suspicion, a confession extracted under pressure, or invented outright to close a politically inconvenient loose end. A minority of historians argue the boys may have simply died of illness, or been quietly moved and later died of natural causes, with the murder narrative built up afterward by Tudor propaganda to blacken Richard's reputation. This is a harder case to make, given how quickly rumours of violent death spread. But it's worth mentioning, for completeness, history rarely offers 100% certainty. In 1674, nearly 2 centuries after the boys vanished, workmen were demolishing a staircase in the Tower of London, specifically near the White Tower, when they uncovered a wooden box buried about 10 feet down, containing the skeletal remains of 2 children. Given the location and the ages of the remains, it was immediately assumed these were the bones of the missing princes. King Charles II ordered them collected and, 4 years later, had them placed in a white marble urn and interred in Westminster Abbey, where they remain to this day, with an inscription naming them as Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. In 1933, the urn was opened and the bones were examined by researchers, including a president of the Royal College of Surgeons. Their conclusions estimated the ages of the two skeletons as roughly consistent with the boys' ages at the time of disappearance. But the examination was conducted with the forensic techniques of the 1930s, which were far less rigorous by modern standards, and it did not include DNA testing, which didn't exist yet, or precise, verifiable methods for determining the biological sex or exact age of the remains. Here's the frustrating part for history lovers. Modern DNA testing could almost certainly resolve major parts of this mystery, confirming whether these are even related individuals, roughly what era they died in, and potentially comparing the DNA to known maternal line descendants of the Plantagenet family, a method that has successfully been used to identify other historical remains, including Richard III's own skeleton, found under a parking lot in Leicester in 2012. But to date, the royal family and the Church of England have not granted permission for the remains in Westminster Abbey to be exhumed and tested. Historians and scientists have petitioned for access for years without success. Officially, the position has generally been that the remains should not be disturbed out of respect. Unofficially, many historians suspect a reluctance to risk finding an inconvenient answer either way. So the strange result is this: the single most famous unsolved murder mystery in English royal history has physical evidence sitting in a marble urn inside one of the most visited churches in the world, and nobody is allowed to test it. Modern historians remain genuinely divided, and it's worth being honest with you about that rather than pretending there's a neat answer. The majority view among historians still leans toward Richard III as the most likely person responsible, or at minimum, someone acting with his knowledge, given his overwhelming motive and exclusive control over the boys at the critical time. This has been the dominant historical narrative since the Tudor period, reinforced heavily by Tudor-era writers including, centuries later, Shakespeare's play Richard III, which portrays Richard as a scheming, murderous villain. It's worth remembering, though, that Shakespeare was writing entertainment under a Tudor monarch, Elizabeth I, which gave him every incentive to make the last Yorkist king look as monstrous as possible. A significant and vocal minority of historians and researchers, including the modern organisation, the Richard III Society, founded specifically to re-examine his reputation, argue that Richard has been unfairly maligned by centuries of Tudor propaganda, and that Henry VII, Buckingham, or simply the passage of unclear historical record, deserve equal or greater scrutiny. What almost everyone agrees on: two young boys entered the Tower of London in 1483 and were never definitively seen again. Whatever happened to them, it was almost certainly connected to the ruthless politics of who would control the English crown, and it changed the course of the monarchy forever, paving the way for the fall of the House of York and the rise of the Tudor dynasty, which would go on to produce Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and the modern shape of the English monarchy itself. So after everything we've covered, where do you land? Do you think Richard III driven by ambition and the need to secure his crown, ordered the deaths of his own nephews. Do you think Buckingham acted on his own? Or do you think the real culprit was the man history remembers as the hero of the story, Henry VII, quietly finishing the job to secure a throne he had no strong claim to? Drop your theory in the comments. I read every single one, and honestly, some of the best historical arguments in this comment section come from you, not from the textbooks. If you enjoy digging into this mystery, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because real royal history is exactly what this channel is built around. And trust me, the Tudors, the Wars of the Roses, and the centuries after this are absolutely packed with stories just as wild as this one. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next one.